You've got a pan here like that, and you've thrown lettuce on top like that. You're shit. You are so shit you don't realise what you're doing.
Hey everyone, this is Jem, and today I'll be ranking the opening nights of every Hell's Kitchen season from worst to best. It should be made clear for the future that when I talk about worst and best, I'm talking more about the skill, talent, and or quality of the subject matter, and when I talk about least favorites and favorites, I'm talking more about the level of entertainment or the likability provided by the subject matter. But moving on, there are also a few things I'd like to clarify about this video in itself. The responsibility of what constitutes a good or bad service will not just fall on the shoulders of whichever chefs make mistakes or don't make mistakes, but also on the teams themselves, Chef Ramsay's handling of the teams, and the timeliness of everything. On that note, if say the appetizers for one season wrap up faster than the appetizers for another season, the first of these seasons will have the edge by that point, but I still feel that the goal of a service is for the service to be complete and to be complete at a high quality, and given that the standards are already high quality for Gordon Ramsay, the speed and progression of the service will be my highest priority in these rankings, which will admittedly lead to odd picks down the line. Finally, I'll admit that it gets more difficult to assess and differentiate the quality of first services around the time of season 14, because at that point I feel Gordon Ramsay was being more strict on the chefs, and he wanted to guarantee that at least one team would be kicked out mid-service so that there would be a losing team for the night. As usual, I will be issuing a spoiler alert for this video, so you have been warned. Unlike my previous video, this one won't be as long, don't worry, and we'll get it started. First off, the opening night coming in at number 23 should be fairly obvious, and that's the one from season 12. This first service stands out for being the only one to have no appetizers sent out. That means that literally no food was sent out to the dining room before Ramsay was forced to close the kitchen. Moving on. At number 22 is season 4. Now, unlike season 12, at least both teams sent out appetizers, but the blue team sucked in the sense that only one noticeable appetizer was sent out by Jason, and as far as they're concerned, they didn't even reach the entree section of the night. They didn't get all of their apps out. Meanwhile, the red team did succeed in getting all of their appetizers out sometime after 6:45, but by the time the service ended, they didn't even have a single entree approved, so that's why it's here at number 22. Now, number 21 comes an opening night with similar circumstances to that of season 4, except that there weren't really any customers leaving, and that is season 10. Now, one very slight knock that this season actually has compared to season 4 is that, at least with season 4, Jason had that one app that came out pretty soon before the service ended. Meanwhile, with season 10, the men didn't send any single appetizers out, a bit like the men from season 12. Meanwhile, on the women's side, they had a similar circumstance. They sent out appetizers, they succeeded with that, but they didn't send out a single entree. But what I decided gave season 10 the edge over season 4 is that, at least at around 6:45 when Roshni was kicked out, Barbie took over and appetizers started to move out at a bit of a faster pace on the red side than on the red side for season 4. And at least when they got to that phase where all their appetizers were done and they're ready to move on to entrees, the women were at that point before 7:20, before Christina started to have problems with her meat. Meanwhile, with season 4, it was made evident that it was pretty much right before Gordon Ramsay was going to close both kitchens. Now for number 20, and this is the last opening night where no entrees are served on either side, and that is the one for season 8. Now for this one, there's an argument that maybe it should be placed lower than season 10's opening service just by virtue of the fact that there are a lot of parallels between this opening service and season 4's opening night. But again, it's a matter of which one has the slight edge over the other two, and that is season 8. Because while like season 4, the men didn't actually finish their wraps and the women did finish their wraps but didn't even start the entrees, at least this time the pacing for the two kitchens was a bit faster than for season 4, and I feel that at least the fact that the men pumped out apps this time around gives this season's opening night a bit of an edge and places it here at number 20. Now we're going to move on to a grouping of opening nights that saw at least some entrees leave one kitchen but none out of another, and to kick them off at number 19 is season 3. To begin, the blue team made a lot of mistakes, but they were at least able to finish up their apps and get started on entrees and even send out a few entrees. But what keeps it here is that number 1, the pacing was terrible. It took almost 2 hours for both sides to send out any appetizers, and number 2 is that the women didn't even finish their appetizers. They didn't even get to that point where Gordon Ramsay would give them the first entree ticket. And then moving on to number 18 is a season with similar circumstances, but a couple of tweaks that raised it a bit to number 18, and that is season 2. Now season 2 is notorious for having a women's team that was noted for not being able to send out a single appetizer until 1.5 hours into service, but at least on the blue side, you had Tom of all people send out a good appetizer at some point between 8 o'clock and 8:30, which was between an hour and a half after the service started. But like season 3, the pacing was terrible. The men hit their first entree by the time it was like 2.5 hours into service. But even though we didn't see it on camera, Gordon Ramsay implies after service that the men had sent out a few entrees. Meanwhile, on the women's side, even though they didn't send any entrees out, they at least had hit that point in the service where their appetizers are all sent out and they're going to get their first entrees, which is something that cannot be said about the season 3 women's team. Moving on to number 17, and we have the opening night from season 9. Now, a bit like season 2, was more implied after service that one team in particular had at least sent out some entrees, and that was, in this case, the red team, the women's team. But on the men's team, it was a bit of a disaster watching their entrees portion of the night. They were unable to get the fish out, and 3 of the men had to sit on the side and eat their mistakes. But at least in terms of the appetizers for both teams, the pacing was pretty decent. They were able to move on to entrees about an hour into service, and I feel like this is what propels season 9 over season 2 and season 3 in terms of its opening night. On to number 16, and this is an opening night for a season after which I felt Ramsay was a bit too harsh in terms of how he felt one team was much worse than another. But then after being more meticulous about it, I kind of realized he was actually onto something, and that is for season 6. Because once again, at least one team, the blue team in this case, served entrees while the other team failed to serve any entrees. Now, as much as the losing team, in this case the red team, kept repeating the same appetizer ticket over and over and over and over again, which you could argue makes them worse than the blue team for season 9, they at least were shown to have moved on to entrees given the fact that Amanda screwed up a fish. But what places the season's opening night higher than that of season 9 is the fact that at least the winning team had a better pacing at the start with their appetizers. The blue team was able to get out their first appetizers at around 7:42, which was around 40 minutes after the service began. On top of that, when they had moved on to entrees, you could tell that they had picked up the pace a little bit after Louis was kicked out of the kitchen. Now, this is the final grouping of opening nights where no team succeeded in completing service. And to kick that off at number 15 is season 1. It was made very obvious throughout the episode that these aspiring amateur chefs were very underdeveloped, and as a result, the service would come across as a train wreck. That being said, as much as it was over an hour before even appetizers were sent out, both teams ended up moving on to entrees, and some even made it out into the dining room on either side. But a lot of customers were waiting too long, ended up leaving the restaurant, and Ramsay was forced to close it down for the night. Now into number 14, we have an opening night that parallels that of season 1 in a lot of ways, especially in terms of how Ramsay chose one team member from each team to serve as a waiter for the night, and on one team, one waiter had a poor showing, and on the other team, the waiter had a great showing, and that was from season 5. Now, as much as the service started at 6 o'clock, I like to treat this season as if the service started at 6:20, just by virtue of the fact that there was a blackout that lasted 20 minutes that stalled the service on either side. In any case, both teams had not sent out any apps before the blackout had occurred, but after the blackout had occurred, the blue team at the very least was rejuvenated and they got to send out some appetizers. However, by 9:48, very few blue customers had received their entrees and some of their clients even started to leave, which is sort of where Ramsay decided to close things down for the night. Meanwhile, in the red kitchen, the only thing that was really shown to us was Colleen constantly flopping on spaghetti and risotto and Ramsay mocking her for being a culinary school teacher who constantly flops on those things. That being said, I strongly believe that one thing that did not make the cut was that they had actually moved on and even served a few entrees to their clients, because after service, Gordon Ramsay says that both teams were equally pathetic and that he had to really judge it based on who performed better as a waiter that night. So I believe both teams set out entrees, but what I believe places this opening night over that of season 1 is the fact that the pacing was clearly better for this season's opening night, and also I have to kind of give it a break because there was that 20-minute power outage. Now at number 13, and this is the first opening night from the back half of the series to be on this list, and that is the one from season 23, Head Chefs Only. What places this opening night higher than season 5's and season 1's is the clear fact that the pacing was much superior. Given this observation in the back half of the Hell's Kitchen series to this point of one team always completing service, with the exception of this season and the season that's going to be coming up next. Therefore, especially considering that every chef on the season is a head chef, I would expect for them to be able to finish the service if given the chance. Besides that, to show how top-notch the pacing was for this opening night, both teams had moved on to entrees just after 35 minutes into service, I'd say. However, either side had glaring issues, and at 7:03, the blue team was kicked out, and soon after that, the red team was kicked out, causing for the service to be incomplete on either side. Now onto number 12 is the season right before that, season 22, The American Dream. And I'm not going to talk much about this one because I have the same grievances for this opening service as I have for season 23's opening service, in the sense that they're really good quality chefs, but they weren't given much of a chance after a certain period of time to complete service, which they had the potential to do, and they were kicked out. However, what places this opening service higher than season 23's opening service is the fact that appetizers really went off without a hitch on either side, and they moved on to entrees within 30 minutes. Now at number number 11, and we've got the first of a very small grouping of two special cases, and that is season 15's opening night. Now, on one hand, you have the blue team that didn't even make it to the entrees phase, and if that was the case for the red team as well, this opening night would be placed second to last, right above season 12. But the reality is that the red team at least completed the service, even though they, in particular Vanessa, had made some mistakes along the way. This completion by one team places season 15's opening night here at number 11, where going forward, every opening night will have been completed by at least one team. Now for the other special case here at number 10, and that is season 13. And the reason why this is a bit of a special case is that on one hand, the blue team didn't even send out a single entree, which if the red team had had the same problem, this opening night's placement would be much lower. However, the reality is that the red side made only 2 mistakes throughout the entire service, and they ended up completing it anyway. Now we're number 9, and here begins the stretch of seasons that were difficult to differentiate because there was always one team that completed the service and there was always another team that got kicked out during the entrees portion of the service. And after some consideration, given how it was way too difficult to determine and to pinpoint exactly when the losing team was kicked out in the middle of the serving of their entrees, I felt that it would generally be a better move to evaluate these services based on the performance of the winning teams, and therefore to kick it all off is season 19 Las Vegas. Now the reason why the opening service for season 19 places the lowest out of this next large grouping is because both teams were kind of a mixed bag during service in spite of the fact that one of them completed the service. As far as the appetizers were concerned, it was the men who were doing their first hour very well. They were completing the appetizers at a rapid pace. Declan was handling that very well. Meanwhile, on the women's side, you had Nikki, who was flopping over and over again to the point where Ramsey had to bring the woman into the storage room to ask Nikki if she was done and if she'd be willing to bounce back, to which she did. And at around 7 o'clock, Nikki did bounce back, and the women were able to move on to entrees, and also the men were able to move on to entrees. But it was after at that point, when we move on to the entrees phase, that the men were the ones who were suddenly starting to flop. It was 3 of the men specifically, Drew, Peter, and Elliot, noted as contributing the most to this problem in the entrees phase of the service. And once those 3 were kicked out, the rest of the men were able to recuperate well enough to send good meat. However, after Ramsey noticed some bad fries as well, he kicked the rest of them out. Meanwhile, the women were able to bounce back very well and finish service. However, that does not change the fact that Mary Lou did have a boiled steak at one point, leaving the season 19 opening service here at number 9. Now at number 8 is season 21 Battle of the Ages. Now here both teams were having issues on appetizers, but at least the pacing was faster than that of season 19's opening service. For example, the appetizers were being pushed out at some point between 6:38 and 7:06 because it was around 7:06 that both teams moved on to entrees. However, there were some issues on appetizers. You had Alyssa and Ileana arguing on the red side, and on the blue side you had Zeus's problematic carbonaras. But distinguishing season 21 from season 19 is the fact that the red team had a flawless service from the entrees on and completed the service. Meanwhile, the blue side, even though it's implied by Alex towards the end of the service by him saying, "We were fucking at the finish line," that just maybe they were onto their third to last ticket or something, the blue team got held up twice on the same VIP table by Billy and Charlene on meat and were kicked out for that. Now number 7 is season 14, where yes, you had Michael who flopped a lot on the blue side's appetizers, but eventually they were able to pull through and get to entrees. And once the entrees had started, they had a pretty flawless service. Meanwhile, on the women's side, the appetizers went out much more smoothly than on the men's side. That being said, once the entrees had started, the meat section started to fail over and over again, and the women were eventually kicked out. However, why is this opening night not close to this season 19's opening night? Well, it's because when they were walking out, Michelle implied that this was their second to last ticket because she just complained, "We have one more ticket!" And I do kind of believe her in the sense that if they were given another chance, they might have been able to complete that service and score this opening service somewhere in the top 3. Now at number 6, we have season 16's opening service, where for the first time we have a team that's considered to have done a perfect service with no mistakes. Now you're going to notice the next couple of seasons on this list have winning teams that did not have perfect services, but the reason for which those opening services eclipsed season 16's opening night here is because it was made very unclear as for how badly the losing team did. So the women move on to entrees a bit before the 45-minute mark into the service, and the men on the other hand move on to entrees a bit after that mark. But when we get to see the men's performance on entrees, all we see is them flopping over and over again. We don't really get any indication of how many entrees were sent out, and at around the 2-hour point the men were kicked out. That being said, I have a gut feeling that the men had sent out some entrees because I don't think that at that point in the show's history Ramsey would have waited till the 2-hour point around to kick the men out if they had not sent out any entrees. But still, had they sent out a few, had they sent out a number, had they sent out a lot, we're not going to really know, so that's why it places here at number 6. Now number 5 is season 18 Rookies versus Veterans. Now here the blue team had a near perfect service with just a couple of hiccups on apps, and at one point Jen forgot to bring up her sauce, but then she brought it up very soon after. And meanwhile on the red side, even their appetizers were well done, and it was only at the entrees portion that the red team started to have some problems. And even then, there were some entrees that began to go out, which is a confirmation that is nice to have compared to the blue team from season 16. But alas, you had Scott having his issues, you had Jose having his issues, you had Chris having his weird pencil issues, and then you had Mia sending a raw duck at one point. But regardless, this all gets compensated for by the fact that the blue team was having a stellar night in spite of a couple of hiccups, which places it here at number 5. Now at number 4 is the season prior, and that is season 17 All-Stars. Now season 17's opening service had a very similar trajectory to season 18's opening service in the sense that not only did the blue team win, but both teams got out of the gate at a decent pace and went on to entrees at around 7:02. In fact, if you check the on-screen clocks for both episodes, you're going to notice that both teams from both seasons started their entrees at around that time, 7:02. Now the red team lost because they were clearly having a lot of meat problems thanks to Elise, and eventually they got kicked out because of Manda Salmon. But what springs us higher than season 18's opening service is the fact that Giovanni helped the women bounce back on meat a bit, and they were able to send entrees into the dining room. And meanwhile on the blue side, the only mistake that was really made was Ben having a cold salmon at one point. Apart from that, everything went smoothly at service. And so that's all there is to say about that opening night. Now into number 3, and the last opening night on this list where one team did not complete service, and that is season 20 Young Guns. Now the reason for which season 20's opening service ranks the highest out of this grouping is not only because the women had what was considered a perfect service, but also the pacing was incredibly talented here. Within 30 minutes, apps were flying out and entrees were beginning on both sides. However, into the nitty gritty, putting the women aside who had a perfect service, Matthew stalled the men with a raw lamb at around 6:34. However, sometime after that, the men started to send entrees, but they were behind and they were falling behind. And at 7:30 around, some blue diners were showing their impatience. And it was at that point at 7:40 where Ramsey forces the team to regroup, and soon after that, they flopped something else and they were kicked from the kitchen. Now I think that this is another case where if the men were given more chances, or if 1 or 2 men were kicked from the kitchen specifically, I think the blue team would have been able to recuperate and finish the service with the women. And if that was the case, this opening service would have found itself at number 1. Now number 2, and this is a really bizarre opening night to place in number 2 because the pacing was horrible here, but like I said, completed services have to rank near the top, and that is season 7's opening night. So the women are shown to get onto their first entree at 6:48, and meanwhile on the men's side, they get onto their first entrees at around 7:29, if not beforehand, because Mikey is shown cooking his halibut at that point. A bit like the opening night that's going to be ranking at number 1, Gordon Ramsay adopted the strategy of pretty much rapid firing every chef that started to screw up in a major way at that point. And 2.5 hours into service, once it was Mikey's turn to be expelled from the kitchen, Gordon Ramsay felt that the charge of the remaining tickets would be too much of a burden for both teams to handle with a handful of members on either side separately in their kitchens, so he decided to merge the teams together in the blue kitchen. And at that point, the two teams merged, did a complete 180, and managed to push out the rest of the tickets under Ed's fine leadership. So therefore, even though everything started out comparatively poorly, thanks to the merge that occurred later in the service, the two teams were able to complete the service. Now finally at number 1, we have season 11's opening night. Now like with season 7, there were a lot of hiccups, and like with season 7, there were team members being rapid fire, kicked out of the kitchen, to the point where on the blue side you only had Zach and Christian that were left cooking in the kitchen. However, the reason for which season 11 is higher than number 7 specifically, and earns a spot in number 1 position, is not only the fact that service was completed on both sides of the kitchen, but also the appetizers started to have some success and started to be pushed out of the kitchens within the first hour. And both kitchens moved on to entrees early on within the second hour of service. Additionally, an hour and a half into service at around 7:30, Gordon Ramsay made an unorthodox move on the red team's side where he decided to send out potatoes a bit later than the rest of the entrees, which ended up paying off. And another pro that this season has compared to season 7 is that both teams managed to finish the service separately, and they did not need to merge in order to be able to do this. So in short, the decent pacing as well as the completion of service in spite of the underdog position handed to both teams as the service went on, places season 11's opening service at number 1. And that's it. Which opening service was the best in your opinion? Do you completely disagree with me? Let me know in the comments section below. Like and subscribe to my channel for more good HK content, and please be sure to recommend and share. And here's another couple of videos for you to check out. Toodles!